Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Today we're talking about one fantastic tortoise. Hello, friends, and welcome to Advanced Studio Classroom. I am your host, Joe. We are on the second day of our newsworthy clips, and we are taking a turn away from the International Home and Housewares Show, and we're moving in to talking about a very special kind of tortoise species. Joining me today on our expedition. I feel like we're going on a trip. Oh, yeah. I have David Morton and Linda. Welcome, David.
It's so good to be here. I gotta put my special safari hat on for our expedition.
Right? And Linda, it's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, Linda, I feel like you, out of the three of us, may be the most well-traveled in the room. I have this feeling.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Have you been to the Galapagos?
No, I haven't yet, but it sounds like such an amazing place. Like, I would love to go.
So can you kind of give us like a basic intro? Like what exactly makes this place so amazing? Because I've seen pictures, but I don't really know as much about it.
Well, it's a series of islands, and it just seems to be rife, like just full of different animal life and different species and also plant life. It just seems really rich and a place that you could really go on an adventure.
Nice. I love that word you use, rife. And then you defined it right away. But I just want to kind of pause on that for a moment. Something to be rife with something.
Yeah, rife with it means it's full of it. Another word I like to use is teeming with. It's full of life, teeming with life.
Oh, see, this is where the author in you is coming out.
It's hard to contain.
Yeah. Teeming is a good word.
Teeming is a great word. And actually, I feel like, the tortoise species we're talking about today, there's actually another very famous Galapagos tortoise, but it's a different species. But it's also this sort of same idea of a very ancient tortoise. I remember seeing this documentary. It was called The Loneliest Tortoise.
Oh, yeah. Is it in India?
Oh, maybe.
Because there's one in India that's 200 years old or something.
That's the interesting thing. Some of these tortoises can live a really long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're known for their long life.
And so I think actually the other kind of long living tortoises other than the one in India is also on Galapagos.
Yes, yeah.
And so it's just really interesting to learn about these kinds of creatures that have been alive so long. I was reading this article about a whale that was several hundreds of years old, just still floating around the ocean. That's at least what they're saying. They're carbon dating as we're trying to figure out how old this fish is. Yeah. But it's just so interesting, because of course a human lifespan is 80 years.
Yeah, we're lucky if we
80
get
years.
80. Yeah.
Yeah, and here we have tortoise for it's thought to be, extinct, and here it still is.
Yeah.
So today's article goes just through this adventure of finding out is this tortoise species still alive? Because apparently people believed it was extinct for a really long time.
Right, for over 100 years, they thought it was extinct. But so it's amazing that if it really does exist.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, we're going to begin the adventure today on page 31. So join us as we get our first reading. Tortoise species believed to be extinct for over 100 years, found on island in Galapagos. She is old, but she is alive. A species of tortoise thought to be extinct was found on an island in the Galapagos. Wako Tapia, director of the Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative, found the female tortoise during an expedition on Fernandina Island, the Galapagos Conservancy said. The tortoise is believed to belong to the species Chelonoidus fantasticus, which translates to the fantastic giant tortoise. Unique traits including unusually prominent saddlebacking of the tortoise shell and extreme flaring on parts of the edge of the shell are unlike any other tortoise seen in the Galapagos and can help identify the species. What a dramatic line to start with, David.
Yes, she is old, but she is alive.
Oh, that's so amazing. You know, and you see that exclamation mark and you could just imagine the excitement. There's actually this really great YouTube video of them finding the tortoise and the guy just being so excited as he just sees the tortoise and like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It's just there. And so what's with all this excitement?
Well, they found it's been thought to be extinct, like as we said earlier, for over 100 years. And extinct means to no longer exist. So this is big news that a species isn't really extinct, that it's still living.
Yeah.
Right. You know, for when it comes to animals and extinction, you know, we have all these different kinds of classifications, right, that go with extinction. We also have words like endangered, vulnerable, under threat. And so once you get to extinct level, nobody's looking for this species and there's no plan in place to help like repopulate because they're
all gone.
It's just gone.
Right. But the director of the Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative, and what a title for an initiative, right?
That's beautiful, right.
Now, found this female tortoise during an expedition on Fernandina Island. And this is just a really amazing kind of discovery, but I like this word expedition here.
Right. An expedition is an organized journey that has a certain purpose.
Right. And we have lots of different words related to travel. You know, we talk about adventure, journey, sometimes pilgrimage is used in a certain way. But expedition, like Linda was mentioning, it has like a very kind of specific purpose. And I feel like I see it most often with sort of scientific endeavors.
Oh, generally, because when you go on an expedition, it's traveling to a place in order to study something or search for something. Like you hear about expeditions to Antarctica, right? Like no one really goes to Antarctica for a holiday. Right.
That's true, yes.
Usually, like, if you're going there, it's because, like, oh, we're going to study this ice. We're going to see, you know, like, learn more about the environment, right? So it's usually scientific.
Right. So you often just see sort of scientific expeditions. You see it as a pretty common pairing. Now, this tortoise is believed to belong to a very special kind of species, Linda.
Yes, which, Joe, you said fabulously during the reading.
Oh, I was wondering if you were going to give it a try. This is actually interesting, you know, this kind of like scientific names for things, even for native English speakers, it's hard to say because it's not really English.
It's not English. It's Greek or Latin, usually.
Yeah, usually. Yeah.
Right. So actually, as we were preparing this reading, I remember running up to David trying to figure out how to say it.
And I gave him the wrong answer, actually.
Oh, but this translates to, as you see below, you know, the fantastic giant tortoise, which is just a fabulous title.
It is, yeah. It's amazing. Usually the scientific name or species name will have something to do with a feature of them, or maybe has to do with the person who found it. But here it's just this great name given, or these great attributes given to this tortoise.
That's awesome. But it has quite a few unique traits that make it very clear why it's this fantastic tortoise. So can you give us a little description there, David?
Sure. Well, one is it has unusually prominent saddle backing on the shell, which just means that its shape is kind of like the saddle of a horse. It kind of comes up, around, and down, as opposed to being a flatter shell or like a rounder shell. It comes up, around, and down, like the saddle that you would use for a horse.
Right.
And then on the edges of the shell, you have what they call extreme flaring, which just means that it kind of comes down from the saddle and then flares out, where it kind of like sticks out a little bit, curves outward.
And so to get an idea of kind of like a little bit of the saddle backing, if you look on page 31, we have a picture of a Fernandina giant tortoise that can kind of at least give you a little bit of an idea of what that can kind of look like. And all these traits make it very easy to identify the species, so you know exactly what you're looking for. So while you might not think your saddle backing or flaring are necessarily helpful terms, but if you're interested in animals, these are good descriptors to use to give the listener an idea of what the creature you're talking about is looking like, what it looks like. And so we're going to be going into a little bit more of this particular tortoise's story and the discovery of it with our next reading. A tortoise from this species has not been seen in 112 years, Tapia said in statement from the Galapagos Conservancy. The previous sighting of the species was from a 1906 expedition by Rollo Beck with the California Academy of Science. Beck's discovery was the first and only account of a living organism from the species found on the island until the 2019 discovery. The odds of finding the animal had been extremely low, but a 1964 expedition by John Hendrickson found droppings that were assumed to be that of a tortoise, which renewed hope the species may still be alive. Decades later, more droppings were found on the island near Hendrickson's discovery. To find a living tortoise on Fernandina Island is perhaps the most important find of the century, Tapia said. So, there hadn't been a tortoise from this species found in a really long time, Linda.
Right, in 112 years.
Oh, that's incredible. So could you imagine, you find it once, and then 112 years later, you don't see it. It's probably gone.
Yeah, and I think it's really special because the way that the world is now with, Google Maps and Google Earth and everything seems like we have figured out all of the, seems like we've been everywhere and have kind of mapped everything out. And yet, in the world, there are still mysteries like this.
Right. And it's interesting because we're used to things being so easy to find. I don't know where something is. I Google it. I figure it out really quickly. But this is quite a project, right? So the previous sighting of this species was all the way back in 1906.
Right. On an expedition that was done by the California Academy of Science.
Right. Now, here's the interesting thing. I actually found out you can find the 1906 journal, a scan of it, online.
Really?
That's cool.
You can actually read the handwritten notes of the expedition to this place where they see the tortoise in 1906.
Does it include any pictures?
That one didn't include pictures because it's literally just the notebook of Rollo Beck.
Okay.
And so if you go to archive.org and you look up Rollo Beck 1906 expedition, poof, just comes right up.
That's wild. That is wild.
It's just a little piece of history. And now Beck's discovery was quite special, David.
Yeah, it was the first and only account of a living organism from the species, the same species that they found in 2019. It was literally the only human evidence that this thing even existed.
I almost feel kind of bad for Rollo Beck. Could you imagine you find this amazing tortoise and everyone is like, oh, I want to see it. And then you can't show it to them. And then 112 years go by.
Yeah.
And you're like, I mean, of course, this person's long passed away. But if that person were still alive, the vindication.
I told you.
I told you.
There it is.
Because honestly, the odds of finding the animal was low. Like the chances that you were going to find this, it wasn't very likely. But apparently in 1964, something happened.
Right. On another expedition, this was by John Hendrickson, he found droppings that he assumed to be of the tortoise in question.
Oh.
He found a poop.
Right. So
Said, it's still around.
So droppings is a very polite way of talking about animal defecation.
Yes. And if they found a dropping... If they found a dropping, that means that it's still eating, which means it's still alive, right?
Right.
So it's actually a very special skill it's funny, but it's a very special skill to be able to identify something by its droppings.
I mean, I don't know how somebody does that, to be honest. I don't know how... I mean, I guess part of it is, you at least know that it's a tortoise.
Yeah.
And, maybe its general area and some other factors. But just the idea that you can look at something and be like, oh, it's this tortoise or it's this kind of animal, even if they're kind of similar.
Yeah.
I don't know. That'd be an interesting skill set to have and show up at parties with, I guess. But
what can you do? Well, I can identify different animals by their poop. That's cool. All right.
So, this renewed a lot of hope that the species may be still alive. And decades later, boom.
more droppings were found on the island.
And it was near the initial discovery, so we get the sense that, the tortoise might still be around somewhere in the area.
Yeah, some tortoises tend to be very territorial, and they have very specific migration patterns. So it would make sense that if you found those droppings in the same place, they would assume it was from the same tortoise because they tend to stay in the same areas.
So you get the sense that, this is a very sort of slow journey of discovering this tortoise. This isn't sort of an overnight eureka kind of moment.
And it's funny because it's not like tortoises are, like it might hear you coming and then quickly run off to the bushes.
There's no quick about it.
Tortoises move at they're really slow, and this one's also really old, so it's going to be even slower. And yet they just can't. I guess 112 years go by before they,
Yeah, it's a very elusive tortoise.
Yeah. I like that phrasing there, and it's an elusive tortoise. It may not be fast, but it's difficult to find.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's sneaky somehow. You just can't find it.
Now, Tapia, who, of course, as we mentioned, is the director of the Giant Tortoise Restoration Initiative. That's a long initiative.
Quite a title, yeah.
He looks at this and says, this is an absolutely huge find.
Yeah, he calls it perhaps the most important find of the century, which is, that's a big deal. Granted, if he's talking about the 21st century, we're only 19 years into it. So we'll see. Maybe they'll find another one, and then that'll be the second greatest find of the century.
It's interesting. I feel like scientists and of all stripes, whether you're a biologist, an astronomer, chemist, whatever you are, when you discover something, you almost are obligated to say it's the greatest find of the century.
Greatest find of the century?
Yeah. And it can be, at least up to that point,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Because it is pretty cool. It's a beautiful tortoise, and they thought it was completely gone. And now they found one, And just this island that they found it on, it's not very welcoming to visitors.
Oh.
There's a lot of, very jagged volcanic rocks. It's very untamed, It's hard to get around. It's dangerous. Which is part of the reason, I think, why they couldn't find the tortoise for so long.
Right. It's not the easiest place to go on a tortoise hunt,
right,
as it were.
Yeah.
Tortoise expedition.
A tortoise expedition. There we go. Bring our word back. Well, we're going to learn a little bit more about what the Conservancy has in mind if they happen to find more of the species with our next reading. The Conservancy has proposed an expedition be launched to explore the island further and attempt to see if more of the species are alive. If more of the species are discovered, a conservation plan will be developed. Conservation practices could include bringing some of the species into captivity, the Conservancy said. Should we not find tortoises, we will lay to rest the myth of tortoises on Fernandina Island. Either way, we will finally resolve the mystery of the fantastic tortoises, the Conservancy said. Often after a big discovery, you need to start making a plan. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do with this discovery? And so the Conservancy has an idea.
Yes, so they're going to be going out there to explore the island further and see if there are any more of these tortoises. Is this lady alone, or does she have some buddies? And if they find any more, then they're going to start moving towards conservancy. So they're going from thinking that it was extinct to now, if there are more of them, maybe we can actually repopulate. Maybe there's a way we can preserve and make more.
I almost wonder if this is not why, attaching a label like the most important find of the century is kind of important where, this island isn't the easiest to do expeditions. It's clearly not that easy to explore. And so you probably require a lot of funding for equipment and manpower to do this. And so you start to say, most important find of the century, and all of a sudden people are more willing to fund this kind of project.
Right.
I know it's kind of a silly way to look at it, but I do feel like scientists are often needing a lot of funding to do these sorts of projects.
Exactly. You need justification. You need funding, so you need something to justify why you should get that funding.
Right. And so here, they're going to be exploring to find more. And if they do find more, there is a plan for that as well.
Yeah, so conservation practices would include bringing some, or it could include, they say, bringing some of the species into captivity, which is, I always have mixed feelings about that. That's a good thing so that we can kind of get them, take care of them, see if we can get them to mate, maybe have some eggs, have some babies. But then it's like, but they're taking them out of their natural habitat. And, it's always kind of, I guess, think about what if I was a 150-year-old tortoise being taken away from my home? I don't know. I'm not a tortoise, but I don't think they'll love it.
I mean, there's a reason they've been so elusive, right?
Right, yeah. Trying to avoid this for this long.
Right. So it's interesting, because they're not really putting together the conservation plan now, Linda.
No, this is just a proposal, right? Mm-hmm. But they do want to find a resolution. Mm-hmm. The Conservancy goes on to say, should we not find tortoises, we will lay to rest the myth of tortoises on Fernandina Island.
Mm. And here, to lay to rest just means they're going to solve it. They're going to put it aside. Lay to rest some kind of issue means it's solved. We have our answer.
Yeah.
Now, I think, going back to this idea about how you deal with endangered and threatened and extinct, or we can't deal with extinct species like we talked about earlier, but how do you fix these sort of situations? And here it mentions captivity. Now, of course, above, as we were talking about, and I think it does sort of raise questions of how much human intervention should be used to save certain animals.
Yeah, I think it's in certain cases it can be a very positive thing. Like, for example, in the U.S. with wolf populations, there are some areas where the wolves were hunted to the point of being almost wiped out. In areas of, I think it was in Virginia, there was a type of wolf called the red wolf that farmers and hunters just went out and made a real sport out of killing these things so that they could protect their livestock and stuff like that. But that led to the population of other woodland animals just going out of control because wolves control the ecosystem. They really keep the numbers down. So then when they saw that that was creating chaos and all these animals were actually eating the grass that their herds needed to eat, then people stepped in to find some of the red wolves, put them in captivity, get their numbers back up, release them back into the wild, and then that brought stability back to that region, right? So I think sometimes human intervention is necessary. I think especially when we're the ones who created the problem.
Yeah. But it's difficult, to draw that line. Like, when is it too much, Like,
right. That's really challenging. And actually, I want to say here on Advance, we've regularly run articles about this very kind of issue. I know in the past year or so, we've talked about conservation efforts with pandas. We've also, and your wolf example made me think of an article we did about wolves in Washington State. There was like this island. And I remember really starting to think about the ethical questions that come into play here, where they were trying to drop other wolves onto this island because it was down to 2, and the deer population was out of control. Do you remember that?
I do. And that one was more complicated because the wolf population had dropped, but not necessarily because of something we had done. It was something that seemed to be naturally happening. So do we step in a situation like that? Right.
And so what you often find with conservation efforts is beyond just the logistics of planning out, like, what do you do? There are a whole host of sort of ethical, not moral, but I think ethical questions that go along with it.
Right. I mean, even the question of keeping animals in captivity, that can be quite controversial.
Right, because, of course, you're like, oh, well, this animal should be out in the wild, but then if we don't keep it in captivity, what's going to happen? I know this is a really big issue in areas of Africa that have, lions and, wonderful animals that get poached regularly.
Right. I mean, the panda wouldn't exist. Well, the panda, represents Asia, but it wouldn't exist if it wasn't, in captivity or if humans didn't interfere with its, the whole reproduction and keeping it alive.
Keeping it alive.
You know what I like is I like sanctuaries.
Oh.
Right? Now, when they make animal sanctuaries, what they're doing is they're just setting off a huge chunk of that animal's natural habitat, and they're turning that area into something that humans will monitor and limit tourism in and definitely eliminate poaching. But they're doing that without having to take the animals out of their natural habitat. They're just making that animal's habitat a protected space.
Right.
And that's my personal favorite approach. If I could have a favorite approach to conservation, that's mine, right? And I think that's the most comfortable for the animal.
Yeah, and I can definitely understand where going for a sanctuary approach seems to be like the most natural. You just sort of like block off the area. And I almost wonder if a conservation plan like this wouldn't include some aspects of that.
Yeah, for sure.
But then, of course, in situations where maybe, okay, you only have two, you find like one other tortoise, right? We have one and we just happen to find another, and it just so happens to be a male.
Yeah, and they happen to like each other.
And they happen to think each other
like
okay.
each other, you know what I mean? You can't just be like, hey, okay, and now you're going to... No. Fall in love, natural process.
It's a slow process for tortoises.
Yeah, I mean, they're hundreds of years old. They got to get to know each other,
Oh. And, all of this will happen if they can possibly find more of the species. But like we mentioned earlier, if they don't find any more, they lay to rest this myth. Either way, they'll finally resolve the mystery of the fantastic tortoises. And what a way to wrap up the article.
Indeed.
Oh, yeah.
Join us tomorrow as we continue newsworthy clips. This is Joe.
I'm David.
I'm Linda.
Saying goodbye.
Goodbye.